Hi there, and welcome back to the Energy Sector Heroes podcast. My name is Michelle Fraser, and every week I will speak with incredible people who share their lessons, experiences, and stories from their time spent in the energy sector. Hi there, and welcome back again to this week's episode. If you're new to the show, then please take a second to subscribe and even consider sharing the show with just one other person. This week I am joined by Christopher Springham. Christopher is a global communications and sustainability expert. Christopher, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Sure. Hello, I'm Chris Springham, and I've had a fairly extended and varied experience in the energy sector, from oil and gas through to renewables.
Okay, so how did you get started off in the energy sector?
Well, it actually goes back a long way now. I was writing a book about finance for business. I edited a national book in the UK, and it looked at all the schemes available to support and grow businesses by explaining these grants and other mechanisms in a simple way, in a way that didn't wasn't the language of accountants. It was the language of the general business community. And the book was a big success. I was on a Radio 4, one of the national radio channels in the UK, show called You and Yours, which is a general interest show, talking about this challenge of how in communications concision and clarity are always core principles, but how difficult they are to achieve. And some guy from an oil company called Mobil, which at the time was the second largest oil company in the US and was growing like mad, actually, in Europe, Africa, and Middle East, called me up and invited me to lunch. And I met this gentleman in a suit. I was very wary about the whole thing. And he said to me, would you like to have a job explaining this new oil we've created? It's Mobil One Rally Formula. It's the world's first synthetic motor oil. I had no idea what he was talking about at all. I have no technical background whatsoever. I have an arts education. But I really like the guy. And it's one of these classic things about if you feel a click with someone, then in a way, the direction sort of opens up in front of you. And then he made another statement, which I found completely ridiculous, which was, he said they just started to get involved in this thing called Formula One motor racing. And they needed somebody to put stickers on the racing cars and go around and make sure that all the signs looked pretty, which was basically my introduction to global branding. And he seemed to want to pay me to do it. And I thought this might make an interesting next step. At that time, in the 80s in particular, it was a great time to join large blue chip organizations because the amount of time and effort and resource they put into training and development was stunning. I mean, I enjoyed a really thorough management training and a general business education with Mobil in those years. I traveled a lot. I got to work in communications, in HR, and in working in supporting all the different functions of the business. It was in the downstream business, and I really enjoyed it. And it was a great effort was made to introduce us actually to the sector as a whole and the opportunities in front of us with the graduate intake and with executive development plans. And so I carried on with Mobil until I was invited to undertake a career in television briefly. I re-entered the media world. It was something of an ego trip. It was at the point at which satellite television was first invented, and there was a battle going on in the UK to be the first and the most dominant satellite channel. And I joined them for about 18 months. And then Rupert Murdoch won that battle. The great media proprietor won that battle, and my company was closed down. And stunningly, and rather fortuitously, I was rehired into Mobil in my first European job. And so at Mobil Europe, I helped to grow the brand and particularly started working on some of the political outreach we were doing, some of the internal communications, and I got again more breadth there. And somehow I must have been quite okay at the job, I guess, because I got hired to go to the corporate headquarters in Fairfax, Virginia, in the United States. And there I joined International and Middle East, which is the sort of one of those strange American definitions of the rest of the world. And there again, much more exposure to the bigger corporate challenges and to working in a much more international culture. And I really found myself excited and informed by working in a deep, incredibly diverse international environment. I also liked the fact that they had an amazing art program. So, although I had come from an arts background and I was working in a technical company with lawyers and engineers, I actually got to see quite a lot of amazing art while I was in America, and that was a thrill. And I think there's an important statement that makes about the fact that art can help to create value, retain employees, build an attractive work environment. The next step was probably one of the biggest in my career. I was appointed the company spokesman. And so I was the spokesman for one of the world's largest companies for an extended period of time. I had periodic outings to the White House. It was an interesting exposure to American politics, as Washington is a challenging place to be. But I think at that time we were seeing the very beginnings of diversity, and my American leaders were quite keen to have a non-American voice representing the company. We'd moved the headquarters to Washington, and the proximity to government was absolutely a driving force in the future of the business. And of course, it gave me an amazing and diverse chance to meet some amazing people. And throughout the second Clinton administration, I was briefly seconded to assist on some of the international media relations activity, particularly with Japan. So that was a tremendous thing. Like these wonderful international business careers, you don't really plan your next move, others plan it for you. If you're open to the opportunity, then really the world's your oyster. And that's, I think, still the biggest attraction of working in the energy sector, is its truly global nature. So I was sent back to Europe and worked in the new Europe, Africa, Middle East organization, and traveled to 48 countries in 18 months. And that's too many countries and too much traveling. And I was taking at the time some anti-malarial medication, which was very unpopular. So I felt that I didn't really want to be taking drugs for my job. I couldn't not take them because the risks of cerebral malaria in West Africa were very evident. And we were developing Equatorial Guinea for offshore at that time, Angola, Nigeria, Kenya for the onshore. I realized that with a young family, I was putting myself actually to some degree at risk, and it was time to think of something else to do. So I got hired by Rolls-Royce, just at the point where Rolls was breaking up from the famous car brand to become a fully aerospace company, creating gas turbines for both power generation and for civil aviation and for military aviation. And we sold off the car business. It was my first major transaction, really, outside Mobil, and very, very exciting to sell our car business to BMW, another of the world's most famous brands, and to try to create an aerospace entity, essentially. So did that, enjoyed that, got fired from that in a fairly massive and public way for an unprompted disclosure of financial information in the eyes of the chief executive, who was something of a colourful character, to say the least. And, that's a moment in life. You feel profoundly affected when something like that happens so suddenly. I'm very proud to say now that I was one of 9 directors of communications at Rolls-Royce that was sacked over that short period under that chief executive. So I don't think it was all about me. I think he had a real difficulty with generally with people in the communications function, and was not an easy person. So licked my wounds, looked around, and thought really hard about what to do. Went into consultancy for the very first time, using my political experience and some of the experience I'd had in the energy sector, which helped me to find clients. I did my first major role with the Energy Saving Trust, which is all the schemes available from government for energy conservation and for new measures to create energy efficient buildings, for example. And that was my first exposure really to the issues around sustainability and climate change and how government policy could mitigate some of those challenges. And I also found myself working in a very complicated lobbying role for my former employer, who somehow decided that climate change shouldn't exist. And I know that there's been a lot of accusations around the oil industry being involved in the dark arts to somehow undermine climate science and delay any legislation that might be coming their way. The whole thing is completely true, and I'm very happy to reveal it here, that certainly millions and millions were invested by the oil industry to try to stop anybody believing in climate science. And by the way, they're still doing it. So I find that quite stunning, really. And I think it's interesting that it only energized me further when I turned my back on that and started saying, well, clearly, if we're going to do anything about this problem, we're going to need to invent some new ways of generating energy. And there's going to be a new economy that evolves from that, new kinds of jobs. I wonder if I could get one. And I started collaborating to some degree with some people involved in private equity at that time, with the British Venture Capital Association. And I came across a very relatively well-regarded private equity organization that were backing a little Danish company in wind energy. And I thought I wouldn't mind a go at that. And I went to meet them. And indeed, it was a very small company. And we were at the point where I think really it's reasonable to say that in 2008, the wind industry hadn't really been invented, or if it had, it was in its infancy, and it was nothing like what it became over the 10 years that I worked in it. And I had one of the best experiences of my entire life. I mean, 10 years working with building a company with 15 factories in 8 countries, 15,000 employees, learning how to create value, working in the board room and in the factories, creating and inventing new ways to energize the company and get us through some of the appalling fluctuations in our financial fortunes. And ultimately, we took a decision about halfway through that time after I met a guy called James Lovelock. James Lovelock wrote a book called The Revenge of Gaia. He invented the notion of the Earth as our mother, and was walking around a meeting at the Royal Geographical Society with pictures of the global melt in a brown envelope. No one was listening to him. I had no idea who he was at that time. So I went out to buy his book. And I really started to think about this. How can we continue to go on in the industrial age if we spit in our mother's face? How can we continue to deplete the world's resources for everybody else in the future? And what are we going to do about this profoundly corrosive outcome from the fossil fuel sector? So I decided that it was a reasonable demand of the wind industry that if we were going to say that we were a viable alternative, a cost-effective alternative to oil and gas, we should first of all make ourselves affordable without subsidy. And my colleagues and I devoted ourselves to that goal. And secondly, we should clean up the mess we make. So we declared that by 2018, we'd be the first global industrial company to go carbon neutral. And that we did. We achieved just that. And in so doing, influenced the entire wind sector and the renewables sector. And since then, multiple other sectors have begun to see that this is not only feasible, but it's a way of creating value, because greener companies are leaner companies and therefore more profitable. So we successfully sold our company to our biggest customer, GE. They very kindly, and for some reason, hired me to join GE in their executive group for the renewables business and to set them on a path to go carbon neutral, which they achieved in operations in 2020. And then we had COVID and I stopped. I was flying too much, working too long hours, actually ready. I needed to take a breath, and I think COVID, for all of us to some degree, gave us a period uh, where we weren't necessarily driven by the same goals or concerns. We were all concerned about global health and perhaps more focus on our family over that time. Certainly, I was fortunate to be with my family the whole time during the first lockdown. And I thought, well, perhaps I could help other businesses to do this. Perhaps I could find other sectors that wanted to go to look into sustainability. And when I left, I started to chair a meeting in London called the Responsible Investment Forum, which is the largest group of private investors in the world, directing private capital towards impact. If you listen to the rhetoric, particularly the Trumpish rhetoric that we're all becoming familiar with from the United States, drill, baby, drill, and all of that, you might believe that there was no money and no support for renewables or for businesses that want to conform to environmental and social governance mandates. But just identifying the sheer volume of capital that's moving away from fossil and towards remittances, we're seeing an entirely new economy. It's expanding across every sector, not just energy. There's incredible innovation going. There's attracting so many entrepreneurs, and it's completely re-energized me. So now have a number of direct investments. I'm working very specifically on how to bring green batteries into the event industry, which I find fascinating because I understand a little bit about China. Having been there about 5 times a year for 10 years, I can see how their battery technology and their manufacturing capability can, with our desire, clean up portable power. So I've been working on this.
Yeah, I think I'm losing you a bit. There was one thing that it did that maybe I shouldn't be asking. There was one amazing statement that I think you made, and it was the fact that at the beginning, when they were starting to produce oil, that some companies maybe thought that there would be an effect on the environment as a whole. That is quite surprising.
In what way is that surprising? The oil industry has a notorious record in environmental impact, in negative environmental impact. First, in the obtaining of oil and gas from the ground. Certainly, when I joined the industry, the attention to environmental impact was really relative. I mean, it was more about safety of employees than it was anything to do with the environment itself, and the avoidance of fines. It wasn't to do with investing in the future of the planet in any way. It was a very messy business. What was I doing in Nigeria all that time? I was going down there dealing with public anger about the fact we destroyed the fishing with oil spills from the various producing facilities offshore, off the coast of the area which was affected by what, as Shell certainly managed to affect with the Ogoni people, indigenous peoples locally. They just failed to invest to support those people. Mobil were somewhat better at that. They spent some money in the community and really tried to do the very best to support the community with alternatives. But even during my period there, I was mostly an oil spills reputation manager. So, I managed to see fairly close up the staggering mess the industry had made. And when I became a lobbyist, I mean, all I did was run into expensive people in suits who were trying to deny climate change. I think, the world's moved on, but the fact is the money is still going into funding climate denial, as it's described by the oil industry. And, I'm not aggrieved by this. I just think that the best people to clean the world are the people who make the mess in the first place, because they know most about it. The oil industry is full of brilliant engineers who can come up with solutions to reducing the impact of the business. I mean, look at the amazing technological achievements in creating cleaner fuels. Absolutely stunning. But what we see is, a big, thick, glossy brochure from BP or from Shell saying, oh, well, we're going to be funding renewables and we're going to be looking at biotechnology. And Exxon continues to flaunt carbon capture and storage as the solution of choice. It could have, reservoir management's been with us 30 years. They could have implemented carbon capture and storage decades ago. But the reason is that when the oil price rises, suddenly their interest in alternative technologies and so on disappears. And also the arguments disappear because, of course, the returns are very high on when the oil and gas prices are very, very high and supply is interrupted somehow. Shareholders lick their lips. I mean, I recognize the hypocrisy in this because I also enjoy a generous pension from my period in the oil industry. So, I'm criticizing myself when I do this, and I'm certainly not unaware of the wonderful, talented, and interesting people who are trying to do a better job in the oil industry now. It is changing, but I just think we have to face up to the fact that in the industrial age, yeah, I'm not sure we were very energy responsible, and I'm not sure we were very. I think we might have been energy hungry, but not very planet responsible. I think that's the important thing. It's a very small thing, Earth. I was looking at photographs of the Earth from the Hubble telescope on my telephone the other day, and it's just such a frail and beautiful thing. There are so many of us living here. We're going to have an entirely new model for how we cohabit, collaborate, and how we use the resources and how we replace the resources that we're depleting from the planet the whole time. If you speak to anyone under 15 about this, they're absolutely of the mind that they've been left with a toxic legacy. And I don't want that to be the case. I think we know so much about how to clean up our own act now that there's loads we can do to accelerate the path to a cleaner world and make money doing it. That's really exciting. That's the exciting part of it, is that this is the biggest opportunity since the Industrial Revolution.
Do you think that there will be a lot of changes coming in the energy sector to clean things up?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I don't just think that. I mean, it's evident if you take almost what are the components that drive that? One is government policy is clearly supportive of it, even if you exclude the United States. This is one president, one presidential term. You want to know which is the windiest state in the United States, which has the most onshore wind deployed. Amusingly, it's a Republican president state. It was George W. Bush who opened up Texas to the wind industry because he had a great understanding of energy economics straight out of the oil industry. And he fully saw the opportunity to monetize the incredible landmass that's Texas and stack up the wind turbines there. When we set up the wind industry, it was a fairly arrogant view that we would save the world. And then we discovered that actually the waste we were creating had a very, very significant environmental impact, and we had no adequate plans in place for how we would dispose of defunct wind turbines. And, I remember having very difficult discussions with colleagues about this, different legislation in different places. And here's a really strange paradox. Where in the world is the toughest environmental regulation on disposal of waste? You would immediately think it must be the EPA in the United States or some European countries. Not at all. The only place in the world where I have been threatened or my colleagues have been threatened with prison if they make a mess, really directly and immediately threatened with prison, is China. And while I was in China, where allegedly, according to the Western press, every week they're opening up a coal-fired power station and don't care about the planet, I was invited by the mayor of Tianjin, who is essentially presides over the largest region, the largest, fastest growing and fastest industrializing and energy hungry region in China, to speak to his entire civil service in one meeting, my colleague and I, to explain to them how to create a pathway towards cleaner energy. They were desperate not only to look for ways to adopt this, but to find alternatives quickly and to find the most viable way of making the energy transition work. And if I look at we were talking about innovation here, if I look at cabling, they're manufacturing incredibly smart cable. and installing smart grids much more quickly because, of course, we have legacy grids in the United States and in Europe and in Latin America. China, they can install new, highly developed super grids. So they're leading the way in all of this. And in so doing, they're supporting their industrial economy. Likewise, on waste recycling and other measures, they're on a par with everything we're trying to do in Europe. So I think there's a whole lot of rhetoric around the energy industry. Isn't it a funny industry that way, that because it's so linked to the political fortunes of leaders, there's a huge amount of storytelling around who are the good guys and who are the bad guys. But the answer is there's only one planet, and there's no good guys or bad guys. There are just people who need to really focus on looking for creating value by finding better answers. And I've seen some brilliant presentations from Shell because I presently live in the Netherlands, and I've had close contact with them over the past few years about the kinds of efforts they're making on innovation. I've heard some fairly proud presentations from ExxonMobil, where they always talk about carbon capture and storage, and I have some views on carbon capture and storage, but at least there is at least lip service to the fact that they see this as being part of their future role, and I'm sure that's to do with attracting talented people. I think if you look at the youngest generation coming into the workplace now, they simply won't tolerate working for a company that doesn't take this seriously, and investors likewise are becoming very, very skeptical about being involved in anything where environmental and social governance isn't at least a core part of the business model. But again, I'm a profound optimist. My own view on all of this is that it's really good for business. I certainly would never have dreamt of having a career in wind energy and making big rotors for large windmills. It's one of the reasons we moved to the Netherlands was to be able to explain that the Dutch, some of the brilliant engineers from Delft and Twente and the other Dutch universities, well, the Dutch seem to have a long history with windmills, and they know a lot about it and a passion for it. I mean, it's great to see those sorts of stories coming back to life as a result of what they've achieved.
Yeah, it's interesting. I just wanted to go back. What is your opinion on carbon capture?
Well, I mentioned earlier that reservoir management's been around for 30 or more years, and we've known how fluids move underground at an extraordinary level. We saw reservoir management evolve as particularly as it was almost evolved at the same speed as computing, as we saw graphics and graphic processing evolve, and we were able to get a much clearer picture of what subsea geology was and how all of this driven by hunger for exploration and production. Well, carbon capture and storage is viable. There's no doubt about it. It's viable. It's a proven technology, but it's simply not implemented. And the reason it's not implemented is because it's just expensive. And it's one of a number of ways in which we can mitigate the carbon impact of the hydrocarbon sector. But I'll be blunt with you. I actually think that the reason it's not fully implemented is nothing to do with shareholders or a lack of will. It's actually to do with a sense that some of the argumentation around climate change is over elaborate and is probably exaggerated, and that I think is undermining the will. I imagine I hope some shareholder activists will have more impact on international oil and gas companies. If you read Saudi Aramco's published literature at the moment, you'd honestly believe you were reading a brochure from a global NGO. They're greenwashing at a level which is just embarrassing, and yet they have the most money and resources in the world to put into solving the problems. And I am thrilled and excited by some of the investments they've been making in solar, terrific integration of renewables into grids, terrific contributions to expansion of the wind sector. But in the end, we know where their value equation sits. It sits beneath the sand where the dinosaurs died. it's oil and oil and oil and some gas for fun. So, I'm not sure that I'm expecting to see radical change coming through anytime soon.
Okay. But if the if carbon capture has been available for quite a number of decades, why has it not been implemented before?
I think it's expensive. I think that's the primary reason. And it's been in every ExxonMobil brochure for shareholders for the last 10 years, for sure. And, I mean, credit to them. I mean, oil companies are profoundly technology led, and, they are very inventive. I love that word. One of the things that I always get rather annoyed about when I'm dealing with, I work a lot in an incubator funding organization where people are trying to monetize their PhD. And they very often suggest that large companies are not capable of innovation, but that's contrary to my experience. Some of the most brilliant innovators I've ever met were during my period of working directly in the oil industry, and I firmly believe that carbon capture and storage is not only viable, it's implementable now, but I think that they have to make a step, and they have to make a step to say we should clear up all the mess we make. Once you make that decision, it becomes much easier to go on to follow that pathway and to eliminate waste, eliminate environmental impact, and see where the value comes. You make huge cost savings if you create these efficiencies, if you examine the business and where its environmental impact is. All the way through that exercise, you're re-scrutinizing where your costs truly lie, and you can begin to see opportunities to do things better in a new way with better new technologies quicker. I think that's really, really what I would suggest. That's how the wind industry has grown so fast, and it's grown exponentially now. When I joined, in 2008, there were about 200,000 people globally in the wind sector. Now there are 2.5 million. And the service side of that has enormous potential to grow further. So you can see innovation can actually create these new commercial opportunities. It's not all to the bad for oil companies to take more care with how they impact the planet.
So, do you really think that the energy sector can become more sustainable then?
Now, I not only think it, I know it, and I can see it in all sorts of ways. One of the biggest ways that I see it in my daily life is electrification. And I think it's incredibly exciting what happens when you see a pathway towards electrification and you see it become feasible. What's happening alongside electrification is a new vision of smart cities. The majority of the world's population live in cities. And there's an incredible range of opportunities to integrate transport and to mitigate energy use and to mitigate emissions. So these smart cities can be cleaner. They can present all sorts of different ways for people to get around. Don't you think it's an incredibly anachronistic thing? It's a very funny thing. Just look out of any window and see all these people going by in tin boxes with four wheels on either corner and some smoke coming out the back. Very often, if you look on any motorway driving along, just look left and right, a lot of those tin boxes contain just one person. This might be viable or necessary in a rural context where there are distances between places and so on. But actually, our lack of imagination about the way we get around is greatly revealed by some of the integrated transport policies in China and what we're seeing in some wonderful European cities that are doing absolutely breakthrough things to get people out of cars into public transport, into light rail, into integrating these systems using fantastic apps. If I live in Amsterdam, one of the most walkable and integrated transport cities in the world, probably vies with Copenhagen, Rotterdam, places like that. London's certainly very improving all the time in terms of its transport integration. But fewer and fewer people are traveling in those tin boxes with four wheels one on each corner. And shared, I've just seen yet last week an advertisement for the first shared vehicle in London. An electric vehicle looks like a golf buggy. And I think that's so wonderful, wonderful idea that I don't own a car because I live right in the center of the city. I haven't owned a car for 10, 15 years. And I don't need one because I just walk up the road, I pump 4 digits into my phone, and I've got a car if I need to go and collect the Christmas tree or deliver something. So I think you're seeing the pace of innovation, extraordinary pace of innovation, but also some terrific examples of how by integrating solutions, technology, and also building on the vision of smart cities, we're reducing our emissions, we're improving the quality of life for people, and we're creating economic opportunity, which is unrivaled. And that's why I think this is like this is the next industrial revolution. It's the planetary revolution. For me, it's bigger than .com. It's bigger than the internet. It's the notion that we change our view of Earth as being a capital asset. Natural capital is the future. We think about forests as assets. We think about oceans, clean oceans as assets. Think about our rivers and our built environment completely differently. And we see it much more as an integrated one planet worldview. It's, this is, I get told this by kids, by the way. They draw pictures of worlds where they live and where they want to live. And the story is there. There's this connectedness we enjoy in the world is creating a different world picture. And I'm really excited. I'd love to come back in 50 years and see how people are getting around. I think it's going to be fantastic.
Do you think it'll change quite a lot in the next 50 years?
Faster and faster. I really do. I think it's you take literally any sector, and you start to see extraordinary acceleration and speed of change. There's a very funny the British journalist and commentator who's wildly popular because of what he's saying about agriculture at the moment, Jeremy Clarkson, somebody who I've really known throughout my career because he was a prominent British journalist in motoring at a time when I was trying to flog oil. So I enjoyed very much his company. He's a very funny man and actually a very kind man as well. But he made a brilliant point a few years ago at his sort of what I would call peak petrolhead years. He will always be a petrolhead, but he had a certain. There was a time when everything that went vroom vroom was popular, and his television show Top Gear was at the top of all the ratings. He made a point that actually mankind, since the war, had started to go more slowly. There was a period in the post-war era where, being the fastest and creating faster cars and faster aeroplanes, you think of Concorde, for example, was actually a kind of a naturally accepted goal. But in fact, if you look at civil aviation, we started to fly slower and slower in order to make it cheaper. There's no need. Concorde got me I was fortunate to fly on Concorde. It got me to the United States in 3.5 hours. Now the standard is sort of 6 and a bit, and from the UK, and it hasn't changed much. Airplanes fly at 550 miles per hour and ground speed, and that's deemed to be optimal for resource and cost. So that's one example where it hasn't moved so quickly. But then one of the great joys of having had a brief spell working in the aerospace sector is you do get that chance to see people at the front end of innovation. And I think new aircraft will come, and I think we'll see new ways of flying. I'd love to see some more of those things that we saw on the famous Star Trek website. I think we've all had a peep at it. The theory being that everything that appeared in Star Trek came true. Doors that open automatically and communications devices that you hold up and phasers like tasers. Well, the bit that they haven't worked out yet is beam me up, Scotty. But I guess with particle physics and telecommunications, who knows? Could it happen? I feel it's just the possibilities are endless and the speed of development is endless if we make a deal with the planet, if we make a deal among ourselves that we've only got one place to live. Jetting off to Mars if you're a billionaire is not the solution. Clearly, you have to say, why would you spit in your mother's face? If Earth is mother, why do we do this? It's tragic and it's pointless. And the best news of all, we can fix it.
But can we really fix it? Have we really left it too late?
Mm. Well, while I was at university, I had a brief spell working with a lot of archaeologists. It was one of those things where you had an optional course, and I was fortunate to. I really enjoyed archaeology, and I liked looking at. I liked the people it attracted, and one of the things that experience brought me was the idea that really archaeology is looking at things before history, looking at societies and trying to piece them together from the rubbish that they left behind. In some forms, skeletons, but really it's grave goods and it's the marks that buildings left and it's evidence of what they ate and all of that stuff. So, we've been leaving trash since we arrived here, going right back to ancient civilizations. But the way we leave trash in our planet now, without reprocessing it and without seeing that as an asset, I mean, waste is a fantastic asset. I have the privilege to be part of a movement which helped to accelerate in Denmark last year, where realizing that the composite waste impact from the wind industry was unacceptable, we decided to sit down as a group and really see whether we had a solution for fully reprocessing all the waste we had created. And I'm very pleased to say that not only have we solved that technically with 3 or 4 different methods of waste disposal, the biggest one of which is closed pyrolysis. It's returning materials back to the composite materials, the materials that composites are made of, resins and glass, fiberglass in particular. And we can do all of that and generate heat while we're doing it, which enables the process to continue in a cycle. Then we can supply that material by as the old blades come down from wind turbines and the new blades go up, we've got an adequate supply chain of base stock to justify building plants. And so it was great to see academics, policy people, scientists who've invented this, but best of all to see the investors there sniffing away and saying, my goodness me, there's some waste, but we can make money doing this. We can reprocess all composite waste now. Well, that's exactly the attitude we need. Let's go back to what the mess we've made and say, all right, what opportunities does that provide? Let's be modern archaeologists and say, where are all the metals? Why do we need to dig for more metal? If we have a ton of metal we've wasted, then we can do something with that ton of metal again. Terrific rethinking going on. There's a wonderful book called Cradle to Cradle, and it's on my desk somewhere, but I can't actually find it, which really talks about circularity in the economy in basic principle terms. And it's very helpful because it helps you to figure out this loop of resource allocation, resource distribution, resource processing, and then at the end of life, how we start to design with the end of life in mind to the next life that this resource might have. That's there's a very interesting example parallel going on in the fashion industry at the moment. I work with a young entrepreneur who's brought attention to the staggering levels of waste that the fast fashion in particular creates. And China is certainly most culpable in the world for enabling this waste, because we have this gargantuan appetite for disposable fashion. And she's been pioneering incentives that go directly against that, to recycle, to reuse, to repurpose clothing, just as our forebears did. My grandmother mended everything, made most of what she had and mended most of it. It's a very short period of time since we became addicted to this ridiculous need to have a new pair of underpants every 3 weeks. These things are repairable. So the fashion industry is doing a lot in circularity, in rethinking how we prevent waste, how we design to prevent waste, and how we repurpose what is wasted to create new and desirable new things. My daughters are in their 30s now, and they're both they're certainly fairly adamant and quite angry with me on the issues of climate change and very, very aggressive about recycling. And, I'm thrilled by that. I mean, they annoy me when they yell at me, but they're right. We need to use less and dispose of things more carefully and take more care. And none of that is expensive. It's just will. It's just will.
But then do you think that in today's society that we're now developing that will because we didn't before?
I mean, I don't. By the way, I don't. This thing about the world of bubbles, online social content and the way we receive news and information now. There's this theory of bubbles that we are so able to select the content we watch that the algorithm starts only to feed us the stuff we want to see. Well, I am certainly somebody who has stepped in to one particular bubble. I actually don't know or freely associate with anyone I know who profoundly disagrees with me on the issue that we need to look after the planet. I love that when I get the opportunity. I mean, I really do love having this discussion with colleagues and former colleagues, and I'm open for that discussion in every aspect at all times. I'm not by no means an evangelist on this without accepting that not everybody agrees that we should do anything about the planet. Because clearly they don't, because if you look at behavior, they don't really believe this. My last boss, great guy, fantastic guy, totally committed on issues of climate and environment, but he's just bought himself a massive cabriolet with V12 in it. I mean, there's a gap there between what he thinks and what he's doing. And, I mock him for it. And I'm quite happy to do that.
Okay. So how do you think that the energy sector will evolve going forward? Will we still have to rely on producing oil, or do you think that will become less and less?
I mean, a world without oil is really hard to imagine because, there are lots of things in the world that rotate and they all need oil. So, and all that public transport, that integrated public transport I mentioned that's running on new clean electricity generated by renewables, it still has wheels and they still need to go round. We can't run an industrial society without oil, but there are other lubricants that are being developed even now, which are very exciting, which can be deployed in new and difficult and challenging applications. And I'm sure we'll get better lubricants, just as when I started my career, they invented synthetic motor oil. I'm sure that we'll see other things. One of the areas I know that this is happening in most of all is in coatings, intelligent coatings and graphene and these amazing new materials. I'm sure they'll present other ways in which we lubricate and other ways in which we fuel things that we haven't yet considered. But the answer is, do I think that the oil industry will die? The answer is no. I think it will adapt. And I think we'll adapt to what demand picture looks like and to where the opportunities are. I mean, one thing I really loved about my colleagues is, they certainly knew how to make money. And, I'm not for 1 minute suggesting we go to a pre-industrial society, quite the opposite. I just think we need better growth. So, I see the oil industry there. I think gas has a very long future. I don't see how, with the level of energy demand that we have on the planet and the kind of political challenges around resource, I can see gas having a history for a big future. Hopefully we can learn cleaner ways of burning it and cleaner ways of utilizing it. The big and surprising one for me, the one that I think is really exciting, is nuclear. I think the nuclear industry has an amazing reputation on safety. It's had its spells of disaster and they're all well catalogued. But the fact is, contemporary nuclear technology is really excellent. And localized nuclear is also very interesting. One of the reasons I'm so enthusiastic about nuclear is, like James Lovelock, this, I think, is the fastest way to mitigate our overall carbon emissions and prevent some of the drastic temperature rises that we're potentially going to experience as a result of this. So nuclear, I think, is exciting, and I hope nuclear can attract some of the young engineers that it needs to become even better. I hope that we can develop it in Western democracies as fast as they're working on it in China. I mean, it does bother me that we don't address the necessary resource and put our financial muscle behind it. It's a terrible thing that in Britain we're rebuilding a nuclear power station with French technology and Chinese money, and it's fully possible for the British government to commit itself to doing that alone and making it viable. So then we go on to what will happen in the renewables sector, and let's look at a couple of things that nobody ever talks about. Hydro. Hydro is, again, much criticised for its vast environmental impact, damming large areas of China and distressing the local population and the local environment at great levels. But hydro is profoundly effective, and it has a very slow payback, so it's not very attractive to investors, but it's a great way to generate energy. I think hydrogen within gas, there's such a long list of opportunities. Blue hydrogen, green hydrogen, that's again very exciting. And then for me, wind has just become, I mean, wind and solar have reached the point where it's very difficult to make money in wind and solar at the moment because the cost has come down so much. Solar's, I think the last time I looked, about 7 cents per kilowatt hour. And, it's costing a lot of money for people in the oil industry to say, well, it only works when the sun shines. Actually, the sun is always shining somewhere. So it's a question of solar combined with smart grids. They say this, by the way, I spent a lot of time in community meetings being yelled at about the fact that wind turbines didn't work. It only works when the wind blows. But we've learned a lot about where to put wind turbines, and you'll be amazed to hear that no investor will invest in a wind farm where it's not very windy. So the best class wind areas, it's blowing almost constantly, and around the British Isles, it's always blowing somewhere. So that's true, I think, of a lot. We're seeing floating offshore wind turbines now. That is a great example of technology and experience and talent from the oil industry transferring its way across in subsea technology to enable us to develop wind in offshore Japan where the continental shelf is so deep. Let's embrace each other, renewables and fossil, and be the best the world needs. So I think it's great. Can you see all of those ways? Things are new ways to make money, I think, from the energy sector.
I think it is as well. I think it is amazing. I think the younger generation has got a lot of exciting opportunities to come into the energy sector for their careers.
Yeah, yeah. Well, actually, a word on that. I mean, one of the strangest things about the way my career has gone is I've ended up working with more young people now than I did when I was a young person. When I went into Mobile in '85, everybody around me was a bit older. I was one of a very small group of graduates and postgraduates starting their careers, but really the majority of people were older than me. And there was an awful lot of men in that group. What I'm incredibly thrilled about, and one of the things that I think sustainable thinking brings, is the value that what diversity and equality of opportunity, how it transforms businesses, how it brings creativity and better stewardship. I'm seeing far, far more young female colleagues and contacts and people coming to me with CVs who've come through programs like STEM. Not enough, but far more young females looking for careers in things like the energy industry. I've seen also among my peer group in the energy industry women who've come through to take not just a role at senior management level, but actually gone on to lead the industry. One of my heroes in the energy sector is Louise Kingham, who ran the Energy Institute in Britain for a long time, she's an extraordinary human. I mean, she talk about heroes. Her capability and her ability to bring together people with different views in one room and get them to align on how to move forward is terrific. And she inspires me. I follow her, and now I probably have a dozen female mentors who've gone on to achieve far greater things than I ever have in my career, who work in the energy sector and work in sustainability. So I think more diverse attitudes towards the value that diversity brings comes with a sustainable and a circularity mindset. And I hope my daughters have better opportunities than I had. They're both, one is a teacher, the other one's a designer, and they have a glass ceiling that they still have to deal with, which I find very, very tiresome. I mean, I really do. The number of times, even as I was briefly the head of HR for a number of years in LM Wind Power, and I constantly looked at our shoddy performance on bringing young females through to the leadership level more quickly. I'm proud to say we managed to get one woman on the board by the time I left, but that's nowhere near where it needs to be. And in the investment sector, I now chair this group meeting I was explaining, the Responsible Investment Forum. Wow. Now that was a meeting entirely of men in suits 5 years ago. Now it's not half, but it's close. And the best thing about the fact that the balance is there is the meeting is very, very powerful. People are extremely open and available and sharing in a different way than they were before. But the part that I think certainly this year, when I did the meeting I last did the meeting in November, that really struck me was that on our speaking panels, we've got women who are, in their second or third role as a CEO or as a leading fund manager, these are role models that just didn't exist 5-10 years ago, and I think that is going to create a tsunami of high performing, talented women in leadership roles in the future, and perhaps they will also be a little bit more committed to the idea that the earth is our mother, and perhaps we should treat our mother better.
I think so too. I'm going to wrap things up there on that note. So that's all the questions I have today. I would like to thank Christopher for your time. That brings us to the end of another episode. Thanks for listening, and see you next week. That brings us to the end of another episode. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the show, I'd like to gently encourage you to leave a 5-star rating wherever you listen to podcasts and share the show with another person. You can also follow me on LinkedIn or via my website, www.michellefraserconsultancy.com. Thanks again for listening, and see you next week.